All right, ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling nationalism.
Ooh, a big one.
Definitely. And you've given us some great material to work with.
Yeah.
Imagine Communities, that's a classic.
Oh, Benedict Anderson, love it.
Right.
Right.
And then a focus on the Balkans. So clearly you're interested in how this whole nation idea even came to be.
And how it played out in a region, well, let's face it, as complicated as the Balkans.
Exactly. To help us make sense of it all, I've got our expert here.
Happy to be here. So where do we start with something as, well, huge as nationalism?
Right. I was thinking maybe to understand how nationalism took hold, we almost need to look at what came before.
I like that, as sort of before and after.
Yeah, see what changed so dramatically. And I think the Ottoman Empire gives us that contrast.
Oh, absolutely. For centuries, they ruled over an incredibly diverse population.
And with a level of tolerance that's, well, pretty remarkable, especially compared to what was going on in Europe at the time.
Totally different approach. The Ottomans had this system, the millet system.
Right, I read about that. It sounds like they were way ahead of the curve in terms of accepting different cultures, different religions, all within their empire.
The millet system was key. Different religious communities, Orthodox Christians, Jews, Armenian Christians, you name it, they could basically manage their own affairs under Ottoman rule.
So not about imposing one dominant culture, one religion.
Nope. Live and let live, kind of.
But wouldn't that kind of system actually work against nationalism? You know, if people are allowed to keep their own distinct identities.
You'd think it would make them less likely to want to break away, form their own nation. That's a good point. And for a while, it worked. But meanwhile, over in Europe, things were changing.
The Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment, emphasis on reason, individual liberty, all that.
Good things, right?
Of course. But it had this unintended consequence.
Which is?
It helped give rise to this new idea, the nation.
So the Enlightenment, all about individual freedom, kind of planted the seeds for this idea of the collective, the nation.
It's a fascinating paradox.
So how did this new idea take hold?
Well, this romantic nationalism, as it's called, really emphasized your primary identity being tied to your nation.
Your nation. Defined how?
Connected by language, ethnicity, shared history. And that's when the Ottoman model, all these different groups coexisting peacefully, well, it started to seem kind of outdated.
And that shift had to create some serious tension within the Ottoman Empire.
Absolutely. Imagine you're part of a minority group within the empire.
Okay.
And you're hearing all these ideas about self-determination, nations having their own states.
Right.
You start to look around and think, well, we have a shared language, a shared history. Why not us?
So these internal pressures are building as different groups, Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, they're starting to see themselves as distinct nations.
And deserving of their own states.
And that, of course, ultimately contributed to the Ottoman Empire's decline.
Fragmentation, exactly.
Okay, so this idea of the nation is taking root. But Benedict Anderson, he argued, it's not like people just woke up one day and realized, hey, I'm part of a nation.
No. He called nations imagined communities.
And that's the title of his book, which is brilliant, by the way.
Oh, it's a must-read. He shows how nations are constructed, almost like built.
Out of what?
Shared experiences, cultural artifacts.
Where?
And I think one of his most important points is the role of communication in all this.
Communication? Like what?
Well, think about newspapers. Suddenly, everyone's reading the same news at the same time.
Creates a shared experience.
Exactly. This feeling of being connected to something bigger than yourself, even if you've never met those other people reading the same paper.
Interesting. Like even a national anthem is a kind of construction, right? Gets those feelings going.
Absolutely. And novels, too. They let readers imagine the lives of others within their nation.
Builds empathy, a sense of belonging.
Right. And these imagined communities, they became incredibly powerful, especially with nationalism on the rise.
You know, it makes me think about how the rise of Greek language newspapers within the Ottoman Empire, it really went hand in hand with growing calls for Greek independence.
It gave them a shared narrative, a sense of being Greek, even if they were spread out over vast distances.
Perfect example of how these cultural artifacts, as Anderson said, weren't just reflecting national identity, they were actively creating it.
I could have said it better myself.
All right, so we've got the Ottoman Empire weakening, this idea of the nation spreading like wildfire, newspapers fanning the flames. Where do we go from here?
Well, this is where we run into a term you might have heard of, balkanization.
Balkanization doesn't sound good.
Not really. To understand it, we've got to look at how all these rising nationalisms played out in a region, well, already famous for its diversity, and let's be honest, its complex history.
So basically, the Balkans become a prime example of how nationalism, while great for uniting people within a nation,
Can also be a source of division and violence between nations.
yikes, so the very thing that was supposed to bring people together,
End up tearing them apart.
oof. And to think, it all started with the Enlightenment and those great ideals of individual liberty
Sometimes the best intentions.
have unintended consequences.
Exactly.
So the Ottoman Empire, with its diversity, it's like it was set up to be vulnerable to these new forces.
Especially with those unclear national boundaries. A recipe for, well, trouble.
Okay, so things are getting messy in the Balkans. Different groups fighting for power, borders shifting, and we're starting to see that darker side of nationalism emerge. But what did this mean for the people living through all this?
Yeah.
What kind of lasting consequences did it have? I have a feeling this is where we really start to see the human cost of it all.
You're absolutely right. It's a period of immense suffering.
I mean, what are we talking about specifically? What kind of things were happening?
Well, as these different national groups were fighting for control, you see waves of violence,
Yeah.
displacement of people, and even attempts to erase or assimilate entire cultures.
Wow. It's hard to even grasp the scale of that. I mean, forced migrations, attempts to rewrite history. Were these things happening?
Absolutely. It's a tragic chapter, and it shows just how dangerous nationalism can be when it turns into a tool for exclusion.
Or even extermination?
Right. And the Balkans, well, it became this kind of testing ground for these competing nationalisms.
With devastating consequences.
Wars, ethnic cleansing, forced assimilation. It's a period marked by just incredible loss and suffering.
Okay, so these newly formed nation states, they were built on these, as Anderson called them, imagined communities.
Right.
But were they even viable? I mean, did they create stability in the long run?
That's the big question. And honestly, in many cases, the answer is no.
Really?
A lot of these new nation states, they were struggling to establish themselves.
To define their borders, their national identities.
Exactly. And that instability often led to more conflict, more tension.
A vicious cycle.
It's like the nation state, in some cases, it was just too artificial a construct to really work.
It backfired.
In a way, yeah. This idea of creating a homogenous nation state, often based on a very narrow definition of ethnicity or language, well, it clashed with the reality on the ground. You had diverse populations and all these long-standing cultural ties that went beyond those new national boundaries.
It makes me think about imagined communities again. If a nation is essentially imagined, as Anderson argues, wouldn't that make it really fragile, vulnerable to being manipulated?
That's a great point. And unfortunately, that's what we see happening time and time again.
Leaders exploiting these feelings of national identity.
For their own gain, to stir up resentment, justify aggression, silence dissent.
Nationalism becomes a tool, not just for unifying a group, but for controlling them.
And the 20th century gives us so many examples of how that can play out. Fascism, ethnic conflicts, propaganda, it can be really destructive.
It's like this double-edged sword.
Right. Nationalism can inspire incredible acts of courage and sacrifice, but it can also be twisted into something truly horrific.
So as we're thinking about the legacy of nationalism, not just in the Balkans, but everywhere, how do we reconcile these two sides?
It's the challenge of our time, isn't it? How do we acknowledge the power of nationalism to unite and inspire, but at the same time guard against its potential for division and destruction?
Because both are very real.
Absolutely. There are no easy answers here. But I think one key is to move beyond these narrow, exclusionary definitions of national identity.
So instead of saying a nation is based solely on ethnicity or language or religion, we need a more inclusive vision.
Exactly. A vision that recognizes that identity is complex. We can be citizens of a nation and members of a global community.
They don't have to be mutually exclusive.
Right. And I actually think Anderson's concept of imagined communities can give us some hope here.
How so?
Well, if nations are ultimately imagined, as he says, then that means we have the power to reimagine them.
To create more inclusive and equitable visions of belonging.
Yes. Instead of just accepting these predefined notions of what it means to be part of a nation, we can actively shape them, make them more reflective of the diverse world we live in.
Okay, so we're not just stuck with these old ideas.
Yeah.
We can actually do something about it.
Exactly. And I think that's a responsibility that falls on all of us. We need to be critical of nationalist rhetoric, we need to challenge exclusionary views, and we need to promote a vision of national identity that's open to dialogue, to understanding, to recognizing our shared humanity.
So how do we do that? How do we move from these kind of abstract ideas to concrete action?
Well, education is a huge part of it.
Of course.
Teaching critical thinking skills, fostering empathy,
Yeah.
exposing people to different perspectives, these are all essential.
Yeah, if we can equip people with the tools to question assumptions, to engage with different viewpoints, to recognize the humanity in those who are different from them.
Then maybe we can start to dismantle those harmful aspects of nationalism.
It's about building bridges, fostering connections, emphasizing what unites us rather than divides us.
And I think that message is especially powerful in a region like the Balkans,
Where the legacy of nationalism is so complex.
they've seen the worst of what nationalism can unleash. But they also have this incredible potential to show the world what a more inclusive and peaceful future could look like.
It's a powerful image. The Balkans, a region marked by the scars of nationalism, becoming a symbol of hope.
Wouldn't that be something?
So how do we make that happen? How do we move from aspiration to reality?
Well, it's a long road, no question.
Yeah.
But I think there are signs of progress. You see more and more cross-cultural initiatives,
Okay.
efforts to preserve shared heritage sites.
Interesting.
And I think there's a growing awareness of just how interconnected the Balkan nations really are.
So focusing on shared history, shared culture, maybe even shared challenges.
Rather than just the things that divide them, right?
And it's not about pretending the past didn't happen,
No, not at all.
but finding a way to move forward together.
Exactly. Acknowledge the past, learn from it, but don't let it hold you back.
It makes me think about young people. They often seem to have a more fluid sense of identity.
Oh, absolutely. Less bound by those old categories that, well, let's face it, caused so much conflict in the past.
Right. They're growing up in a world where technology makes it so easy to connect with people from different backgrounds, different cultures,
And they're more likely to see themselves as part of a global community.
while still valuing their local roots.
Exactly.
It's like that idea we talked about earlier, cosmopolitan nationalism.
Maybe that's the key. A sense of national pride that isn't afraid of the world, that's curious about it.
A nationalism that embraces diversity, both within a nation and between nations.
Yes.
So maybe, just maybe, the Balkans, a region that's really seen the dark side of nationalism firsthand, maybe they can actually lead the way
Lead the way in what sense?
in showing the world how to reimagine national identity for the 21st century.
It's a possibility worth fighting for.
And it's not just about the Balkans.
Right.
These conversations about identity, about belonging, they're happening everywhere.
People all over the world are trying to figure out what it means to be a citizen in this increasingly globalized world.
And it all comes back to those fundamental questions we started with.
What is a nation? What does it mean to belong? How do we create communities that are both rooted in tradition and open to the future?
Big questions, no easy answers.
But they're worth asking, and they're worth wrestling with.
And that, I think, is a great place to wrap up our deep dive for today.
I agree. Lots to think about.
To all of you listening, keep exploring these ideas. Check out Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. Learn more about the history of the Balkans, and think critically about the role of nationalism in your own life and in the world around you. Until next time.